And then what are those strategies that you're going to be, what strategies are you going to use, to reach out into those various categories of funders? So, for example, working with service organizations like Rotary or Kiwanis might have a different strategy or approach than you would with a foundation or a government agency. So what do those different strategies look like within the categories? And then positioning. This includes your current position in the community, however you define your community, the stakeholders that you have, your donors, your clients, staff members, anyone who's really interested. So what does your organization look like to your community? How will you find out that information? Will you do focus groups? Will you have informal conversations? And then from that information, how do you better position yourself with funders and overall, and then specific funders? And what are you going to keep the same? What's working for you? I think it's really important in the nonprofit world, and many of us just in our daily lives, we're very focused on, well, what are we doing wrong? What are we doing wrong? But also to focus on what you're doing well and make sure you keep going with it. And certainly all of this is well and good, but if there isn't some way to implement a plan, it's just theory. And so I think this implementation piece is really, really important to a fundraising plan. You need to know who's going to do what, when, why, and how. And then evaluation, how are you going to measure? What are you going to measure? What does evaluation look like? Is it purely by the numbers in terms of your budget, or are there other pieces you'll use? And then I refer to these appendices because I typically, for different fundraising plans, I'll write a calendar of activities, which are basically deadlines and goals per month, or things like a case statement, a summary page. We'll get into some of this, but these are essentially the 8 pieces that your organization is going to need to engage in for planning. So I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into some of these. The first is this organizational assessment, and then I mentioned a SWOT analysis. I think it's incredibly important to look at how your organization does overall with things like planning and what your leadership structure is, how you engage volunteers. You need to have a pretty good snapshot of how things work in your organization to be able to plug that into your fundraising plan and how your fundraising plan will be executed. Let me give you an example. If your leadership, whether it's a development director or an executive director, doesn't believe that it makes any sense to write a fundraising plan or isn't invested in some way, then maybe you guys aren't ready for that step. You don't want to create a fundraising plan and move forward with activities if you don't have the investment from the other staff and board that you need. Now, there's ways to help move people along that, but you have to be clear about what the capacity is in your organization, including things like your fundraising culture. Are other staff members willing to get involved in fundraising in some way? That may not mean making the big asks, but it might help to have them involved with the creation of marketing materials or hearing about successes and challenges in various departments or programs so that you can write an effective case statement. And certainly looking at what's your capacity for things like donor research and donor management. I think having a really strong database is incredibly important. And a lot of people just don't have one. I've been the executive director for the National Hemophilia Foundation up until very recently. And it was very hard for us to gather donor information, and in fact, we use GiftWorks ourselves. We really like it. But having said that, we had a really limited capacity for a while, and in our fundraising plan, we wrote out very specifically, we need this kind of database to serve these needs, and why we need to have that database, so other people could see the reasoning. So here are some of the inventory pieces. When I taught fundraising, it was an overview of fundraising class, I asked the students to write essentially mini fundraising plans for their organizations of choice. And it was hard to wrap your head around if you don't do this on a regular basis. And so I created basically an inventory of the items that they would need to request from the organizations they partner with for these mini fundraising plans. And I said, if you can get any and all of these materials, it's really going to help inform how you write your plan. You're going to have more information. So having budgets, any past fundraising plans are actually very helpful. Any fundraising goals, again, if they're overall goals or in specific funding categories, finding out about the history of the organization in terms of fundraising. And this is something you might not find paperwork for, but to sit down with the development staff or the executive director and say, describe the history of fundraising in this organization. What does that look like? Certainly how donor information in terms of how many donors are there, what does the donor database look like. I've talked a little bit about the strategic planning piece already, but I think it is helpful to see where your fundraising efforts fit into the strategic plan, how they complement each other, not complicate, although I'm sure it feels like that to a lot of us, but how they complement one another. And looking at a SWOT analysis or appreciative inquiry or anything that's related to the strategic plan will help draw lines between the capacity of the organization and your fundraising plan. It helps to inform one another. Then certainly looking for documentation such as the organizational structure and the history and the leadership. Those are all pieces you're going to want to build into your plan. And then finally, what have been some successes and what are the challenges? I think a lot of us in our organizations, again, are constantly dealing with challenges, but to reflect on what those successes are as a learning tool as well are really important. So how do you know when you've been successful? There are a lot of ways that a fundraising plan can help with your organization's success. The first is that you're growing your organization's visibility and capacity, right? By having a fundraising plan that you can share across the organization, you engage other people who can be fundraising ambassadors for your organization. Having a plan with goals is going to help you do more outreach and help you be more visible. It certainly expands your funding base because you're looking at current funders and new potential funders. Then it gives you that way to measure your successes. We talked about that in evaluation. It gives you a single unified strategy. I think one of the hardest things for me has been as an executive director or development staff person is that when there are folks sort of going left and right and all over the place, and the big one is being on boards or having board members who want to take advantage of every event idea that's possible. Well, we should do this event and we should do that event, and let's do. And if I have a strategy that I can come back to, and I say that is a really great idea, we should consider that for next year. In our fundraising plan this year, we've committed to doing 4 events, and here are those 4 events. How do you think that idea might complement what's in our plan? It's a way to structure a conversation about what is and what is not possible. Then you're increasing the investment in the organization from other people, internal to your organization. But the other thing is you're finding more and more that funders are asking questions like, do you have a fundraising plan? And I think this is an extension of the Sarbanes-Oxley work that's going on, is that more and more funders want a sense of transparency. They want to see nonprofits running their business as well. And having a fundraising plan is a really important piece to that. We have a budget. A lot of organizations will have a budget, but not necessarily clear strategies for how to reach those numbers. So the other piece is that your fundraising plan is giving you and your stakeholders a consistent core message to work from. And a lot of the times this comes through your case statement, but the fundraising plan keeps, hopefully, it can't hurt, but it helps to keep people on message if it's consistent and well written and well thought out. And people have participate in. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to have more ambassadors for your organization fundraising on your behalf. Now, all of this can be a little bit scary because it can be a bit daunting to have sharing sort of the places where you struggle in your organization as well as your successes. But I think what's really important is that that vulnerability that we delve into as nonprofit professionals helps us get a really clear vision of what's going on in our organizations so that we can build strategies that will help us improve what we do, better serve our missions, better serve our stakeholders, and have a greater impact overall. And so taking a hard look at things and being really honest is something that will actually benefit your organization in the long run. So I have a break here for questions, and we've just sort of started in the interview, and we're going to get next into the nitty-gritty of a sample fundraising plan. But I wanted to see if there are any questions before I dive into that.
Yeah, Emily, we had one from Ken who asked, how does knowing an organization's fundraising history help current fundraising work?
Oh, good question. So I think you can learn, let me draw a parallel too with programs. If you've tried running a program for your organization in the past and it hasn't worked, maybe there's some history there that would be helpful moving forward in the future. You know, if there was a grant, I'll give you a very specific example that just happened to me. We applied for a grant from this foundation. I did not know any of the history, and what I should have done was ask anybody if, you know, who they knew at this foundation, so on and so forth. Well, I found out before I'd come on that they'd applied for this grant 3 or 4 years in a row and had never gotten the grant. 3 or 4 years in a row is a pretty significant amount of commitment and of time. And it probably would have been better for me not to apply for the grant, knowing the history and knowing that I had limited time. Also, knowing what the relationships are with other people who maybe work at foundations or individual donors just helps to inform some of your strategy. And just because something worked once, it doesn't mean you don't want to try it again, but if there's a repeat pattern that you aren't going to see without talking to somebody, that's why you have those conversations about the history. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. And a couple people had asked, what does SWOT stand for?
Oh, I'm sorry. SWOT. Yes. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a strategic planning tool that helps organizations analyze what are both internal and external strengths/opportunities and weaknesses/threats. And a lot of strategic planners will use that SWOT analysis to help organizations start thinking about where are the strengths and where are the challenges.
A number of people have been asking if they're a new organization, brand new organization. How do you what are some thoughts that you might have about implementing some of this for them?
You bet. Excuse me. Yeah, great question. New organizations, I feel like this is incredibly important. And one of the things that new organizations in particular can do is look at models of similar organizations and some of the activities they've had in terms of fundraising that have been successful. I think that you have to, again, you have to start with a baseline. And so for organizations that don't have much history, if any, that's okay. You start with what you've got. And I think when we talk about the sample fundraising plan, there's going to be places that you'd be able to say, excuse me, you'd be able to say, oh, well, we don't have 3 years of budget. Okay, well, what do you have? Start with what you've got and build from that. And I actually think starting with a fundraising plan early on is really brilliant. this, in a lot of ways, for a lot of nonprofit organizations, their fundraising plan is almost their business plan, because most nonprofits that I know of don't have any kind of business plan. So a fundraising plan is at least going to help them plan for their budget. So that's what I would say. Just do what you can with what you got.
Great. A couple people. Well, let me go through a couple more, I guess, simpler ones in some respects.
Okay.
First of all, how much time should it take to put together a development plan?
Oh, that is a good one, and a loaded one. There's a lot of factors, right? There's the size of the organization in terms of budget. There's it depends on the size of staff. It depends on the level of participation. So for me, when I'm consulting with organizations and I need to meet with the board and the staff, all that scheduling can take a lot of time, can take time to get materials. You know, for a fundraising plan, it usually takes me about 6 months, and 3 to 6 months, even if I'm delving in, because there are a lot of moving pieces. I've also, for my organization, when I was a staff person, I wrote our fundraising plan, I think, in 6 weeks. It was pretty fast, but I dedicated pretty much all of my time just to writing that fundraising plan. So it can really vary, even in my experience, wearing a consulting hat and a staff member hat.
Great. Someone, real quick, I'm just trying to add up a few together.
Sure.
Some people talked about the dollars, like how much. Someone had said how much of the plan reflects concrete dollars versus anticipated dollars. So it's just maybe some about the amounts and some of the financial implications involved with that.
Yeah, you bet. So in terms of your financial goals in each of the fundraising categories, to me, it's a little bit of art and it's a little bit of science, right? If you have consultants who are really honed in on donor prospecting research and are very, very advanced with the research side of fundraising, they are going to be able to provide you with more detail in terms of your goals than somebody else. Now, most nonprofit organizations don't have $50,000 or $25,000 to hire somebody who has that level of expertise. So I tend to look at the past year. If I have a past year, I tend to look at the past year's fundraising goals and use that number as my year one goal, or just slightly over. I'm the kind of person that tends to under-promise and over-deliver. At the same time, you want to set goals that are motivating for people. So if you raised $100,000 last year and you set your goal at $95,000 for your first year in your fundraising plan, that's not very motivating. There's not much of a goal line to run to. And working with your board in terms of percentages of increase is a really good place to have that conversation. Your year one goals should be, I would say, slightly higher than the income that you brought in the year before. If you are a new organization just starting out, you are going to have to take a bit of a wild guess. You can look at other organizations and how they do, but I would say take a bit of a wild guess, because the thing about goals is they can change. The fundraising plan is a living document. Just because you wrote one thing doesn't mean it can't change later on, but it gives you a baseline to say, wow, we were really off, or man, we were really on. So start at a reasonable amount, pick a percentage by which you want to increase your fundraising each year, and keep it consistent across those categories. And again, that's it depends. I think a lot of people had fundraising plans a few years ago, and the economy tanked, and you have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. So it's going to be dependent on your organization. It's also going to be dependent on your volunteer participation, and you know that sometimes you need to change things up.
Great. Why don't maybe Emily, if you want to, I'll give you one more question. Is that okay?
Sure. That's great.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
sure.
We definitely have more coming in, but I know you have some more content you want to go over. So someone
Sure.
had said, Kay had said, when you talked about the SWOT analysis, she said,
Yes.
we have tended in the past to list program strengths versus fundraising capacity. What examples of things should we look at and include in the SWOT from a funding standpoint?
Good question. So whenever I participate in or facilitate a SWOT analysis, the external threat that always comes up is funding, right? And I think on the strength side of things, a strength might be the fact that you have development staff, or you have a fundraising plan, or you have a development committee, or you have good relationships with your donors and funders. That those are really positive things. You have a good reputation or good word of mouth in the community. That's really helpful. You have a willingness to learn new strategies. I mean, I think participating in this webinar alone, that's a demonstration that we want to learn more. We're committed to increasing our fundraising capacity. Certainly things like leadership and the board being engaged in your fundraising efforts or wanting to learn about those fundraising efforts, those are really strong pieces for sure. I think it's important to look at what you have in your own backyard in terms of people helping you out. That's pretty important.
Great, thanks, Emily. And we have definitely some more questions, and we'll have some time for questions at the end as well.
You bet. Let's get going to the nuts and bolts here. Let's see. So this is how I give an overview of a sample, a sample fundraising plan. You could talk to 3 other people, and they may give you 3 other ways that they create a fundraising plan. This is my version. And it's really broken out into these 6 pieces: the overview, your funding strategies, funding category recommendations, positioning, which is essentially marketing, implementation, and those appendices I mentioned earlier, things like a calendar of activities and miscellaneous documents, organizational structure, that kind of stuff. So, and I apologize for the multicolored slides, but hopefully it keeps everybody on their toes. The first section is this overview section, and this seems like a lot, but these are a list of things that can go into that overview section. You want to talk about the mission and the vision of the organization, which should be fairly clear. Your organizational history. When was the organization founded? What was the story? Who's on your leadership? And I mean the leadership by the board, the staff leadership. Who's leading the organization? What are your programs? Now these can be your programs. You don't have to go into a ton of detail here. You know, you could do bullet points, 2 to 3 sentences. This is more, the fundraising plan is more of an internal document, so don't feel like you have to go nuts with the program piece. Strategic plan. Do you have a strategic plan? What are the key priorities in your strategic plan? Who was involved in your strategic plan? Just talk a little bit about your strategic plan in the overview to set the tone for the conversation, so that if I come to you as a prospective board member and I'm reading through your fundraising plan, I can go, oh, well, at least they have a strategic plan, and oh, there's 3 priorities. That's actually really helpful for me to know. What's your current financial position? Meaning, what do your finances look like? Have you been in the red? Are you in the black? Do you have enough money to make payroll? Just to give a quick snapshot of what your current finances are. And maybe that is your budget. It could be last year's financial reports, whatever you want, but you can make it narrative, or you can just share the numbers. And then the funding strategies are, excuse me, what are the big funding strategies you want to focus on in your fundraising plan? For example, We are really committed to diversifying our funding sources, and we really want to focus on increasing donors from individual donors. We know that individual donors give the vast majority of the philanthropic pie. And so we feel like they're a more controllable source of income, and we want to focus heavily on individual donors. To give some background and a little bit of education, this is good. You don't want to get too much into it because in the next few sections you're going to talk more detail. And what are your overall funding goals? What are the larger funding goals for the organization? You know, we brought in $100,000 last year. We're going to increase that. We want to reach $125,000. And we're going to do that by reaching out, strengthening our relationships with foundations, religious organizations, board, and then we want to begin to reintroduce relationships within government agencies or whatever other kinds of opportunities you see. A little bit about your positioning in your community with your stakeholders. Do you have an overall positive reputation that you know of? Do you need to do more research to find out what people's perception is of your organization? You can say a few things about what are the highlights in terms of what do folks need to consider at your organization in terms of positioning. Assumptions for implementation is probably my favorite section, and I don't know if this is because I have a little bit of a research background, but again, all of this is well and good, but if your board and staff aren't willing to help and participate, none of this stuff is really going to matter. So for an example, an assumption for implementation is our board will participate in signing off on this fundraising plan. Our board will create a fundraising committee that will implement the strategies in these plans. Our board will raise money, our executive director will raise money for a part-time development assistant. What do you need in your organization to make sure all of these other pieces are possible? And then steps needed for future funding. So what are you going to have to think about in the future? If you come back to this plan in 3 years, what are you going to need to consider, or even a year or two? What do people need to consider that you're not going to be able to get to in this first round of planning? Okay, so funding strategies. Typically, believe it or not, this funding strategy section is one of the smaller sections that I typically write in a fundraising plan. I talk about overall fundraising strategies, not even only, not just specific to my organization, but just about any organization. That piece about a diversified investment portfolio for your nonprofit is what's going to lead to sustainability. So I almost take this opportunity to educate the reader a little bit about fundraising and say that we need diversified sources of income. We have successes, but we are going to have areas of improvement and challenges that we need to be really honest about. That is going to give us a snapshot of where we are and where we want to go. And then break down the current funding. So graphs are great. Graphs and charts and things are great for this. What percentage comes from this funding category, what percentage it comes from that. It's a good place to use those visual graphs and charts if you're able. What's the funding history? Have you only been able to secure funding from foundations? How many foundations? What has been the history? Again, you need to know where you've been so you know where to go from there. What are your next goals? Here's where we've had successes, or this is what we've focused on, and now we want to take it to the next step. And you can really, in each of those areas, you can break down some of the numbers, if you like, about the funding history in terms of, 50% of our budget has come from X, Y, and Z, to give people some more information about what the history has been. then you're always welcome to talk about things like fundraising trends. Again, I mentioned this piece about that the vast majority of philanthropy is towards nonprofits is done by individuals. That has never changed. It continues to be the case. That might be a helpful thing to include. I'm biased because I've written this book on fundraising from the next generation of philanthropists, but there are more and more conversations about that. Maybe that's something you want to bring up. Maybe something you want to bring up is about social media. What are some trends that are going to be helpful for the reader to see in terms of the plan? And then how will you look for new funding opportunities? So I gave that example earlier about events, which is kind of my favorite one because I think nonprofits, especially in the beginning, tend to be pretty heavy on events. And events take a lot of time and energy, right? It's not that they're bad, it's just that it's helpful to be strategic about how many events you're going to do. So how are you going to research which events? How are you going to research what grant opportunities? Are you going to hire a grant writer? Are you going to be looking online? Are you going to subscribe to different foundation research organizations? How are you going to keep moving forward? So the heart of any fundraising plan that I have written focuses on all of these potential categories, right? So these are a lot of funding categories. I typically go through each category and talk about, for example, I like to start with government because government funding, your organization is sort of either into this or totally not into it. There isn't a lot of wiggle room. Certainly health services organizations tend to look more towards government funding, that kind of thing. If I am engaging in fundraising from government agencies, or I need to explain why that's important or why we're not doing that. And that goes for a lot of other pieces. Is there a reason why you wouldn't fundraise from members of the religious community? Is there a reason why you might not fundraise from corporations? If you do fundraise from corporations, where are your guidelines? I think this is where the ethics of fundraising comes in a lot of times, is that people have questions about who it's okay to take money from and who it is not. And I think that this is a great place in your category recommendations to talk about that a little bit. So under each category, it's important to go into some pretty good detail and talk about the funding category itself. You can talk a little bit about the history. You can talk a little bit about where you want to go with this. And then at the end of each category, I typically list out the first year, second year, and third year goals, knowing that they may very well change. And for things like foundations, let's just say my organization receives grant funding from 2 foundations every year, and one is on a 2-year cycle and one is on a 3-year cycle. So I can put that information in because it's a snapshot of what's going on in our foundation fundraising. We can talk about what tools we've used or would like to use to increase our foundation funding. So for example, having a letter of inquiry prepared to go out to a foundation is really important. We want to reach out to 2 new foundations this year, so we will research them online. We'll make phone calls. We'll find out who in our organization potentially might know somebody from the foundation. The foundation is having some sort of event. We're going to go and show up. So what are some of these very specific tactical things you are going to do to increase your funding in a specific category? I think along with that, your board or your development committee is a really important place to do some board development as well. One of the things I do for any boards that I work with is that we create a job description that includes the fundraising expectations of our board members, which also includes a letter of commitment and the give or get policy of the organization if you have one. And then for a couple organizations I've worked with, they haven't had a fundraising committee. And so one of the things I've talked about in their fundraising plan is that there will be a commitment to creating a fundraising committee and why that's important. I spend a lot of time in my fundraising plans explaining why something is important versus just saying it's important. I feel like that gets people more invested. By far, the largest section of this for me is talking about individuals, because individual donors can mean so many things. You could include board donations under individuals, but there's so many different kinds of individuals in terms of donors. You have small, mid, and major donors. And how are you going to, what strategies are you going to use for working with those different levels of donors? Who's going to do it and how? So a smaller donor, folks who are in your smaller donor level, and that might, for some people, that smaller donors might be $100. Some people it might be $10. Everybody's pretty different what their range is, which can be tough. But so for, let's say, smaller donors under $100 or so, what kind of strategies will we use? Well, I might use more online strategies because you're yielding smaller dollar amounts that way. Annual appeals tend to be pretty good for the smaller individual donors. And the goal is always to engage those donors more and move them sort of up the ladder and bring them closer to your inner circle of funding so that someday they are major donors. And then along those lines, what kind of relationships and recognition and interaction do you provide to your major donors? Are these folks that you are going to spend a lot of one-on-one time with? Are you going to have special thank you events? What kind of tools will you use to raise the dollars that you're setting in your goal? Along those lines, under each one of these bullet points, I think you're starting to get the idea that you need to talk about what's been happening, what you would like to do, what your goals are, and a little bit about how you're going to get there. And even if you're not interested in talking about something like endowments or capital campaigns or planned giving, you can say at this time the organization isn't prepared to embark on a planned giving campaign. In 3 years, we should revisit this and spend some time learning more about planned giving. So rather than just ignore it, make a recommendation for the future. Okay, so under each section, under those funding categories we just talked about, you're going to want to answer some of these questions. So what are the current relationships we have with individuals? Do we have relationships with major donors? With corporations? Do we have relationships that would help us with cause marketing or corporate partnerships with folks? Where have we had successes that we can build on? What are our funding goals, our funding amounts, literally our numbers for year 1, year 2, year 3, and how much are you going to increase each year? So what's your percentage of increase? What resources are we going to use to reach those goals? And are those resources things like professional development? Is it board relationships? Is it hiring new staff? What are the resources that you need to implement and reach those goals? And what is our approach going to be under each one of those funding categories? We talked a little bit about that. Share specific examples where you can as well. So we had a really great experience with this foundation process. It went quite well, and here's what we did, and here's what we would recommend continuing to do. I find an illustration by example is enormously helpful for people. So you've moved through this big chunk of funding, and that, again, for some organizations, that piece can be 20 pages long, just the funding category recommendations. In order to raise money, I think marketing and fundraising go hand in hand. Most organizations, and I tend not to recommend this, but it is what it is, their marketing person is the same as their fundraising staff because those two pieces work so closely together. So positioning includes things like marketing, branding, public relationships, reputation and relationships with funders, your current marketing efforts, what you need to do to prepare your marketing, that is, where are your strengths and your weaknesses in your outreach? What research do you need to do? Is it going to be valuable for you to research social media as a potential marketing tool? Is it going to be valuable for you to look into more mainstream television ads? What kind of research do you need to do to find out how to position yourself, your organization, in the right place to yield the most amount of dollars? And then what's going to be your approach? How are you going to implement your marketing? Well, again, will you use things like social media? Will you ask board members to help build relationships in the public relations arena? Will you recruit board members who have experience with marketing? Will you start a marketing committee? How are you going to implement and think about marketing as it relates to your fundraising categories? All right, so this is one of my favorite sections on implementation. Who are your key players? Who are the people that are going to help implement all the pieces that you've put into your fundraising plan? Is it staff? Is it volunteers? Who's involved? Your leadership, whoever your leaders are, however you define that, have got to be involved in the implementation process. If you're working with major donors, most of the time they want a connection with your executive director first and foremost. They want to have somebody at the top explaining to them what's going on. You really need to have clear and organized donor records in order for effective implementation. To not know a donor from year to year or month to month and not know their history is a real liability for your organization. There's certainly lots of software. There's a lot of software out there. I've shared my preference, but to have something to help you track the history and to steward those relationships and cultivate new relationships and prospect relationships is really important. And then what's your capacity? It's okay to say in this section, we have a real limitation in that we don't have a development director, or we have a real limitation in that the leadership isn't engaged in fundraising, and we have to deal with it. I've written fundraising plans that have been, hard for people to read, hard for executive directors and board of directors to read because they felt personally offended if they were being called out about not fundraising. This is part of your commitment to the organization, is that if you cannot fundraise, at least you need to work with your development staff, whoever they might be. This is actually about the mission of the organization. It's not necessarily about you personally, but it has to be a successful business. You can't have a successful nonprofit business without the capacity, and you need people to do that. And knowledge. So set realistic goals, and even in your implementation section, you can write about why it's important to set realistic goals, why it's important to focus on how you set goals, not just what those goals are. And then how are you going to build those relationships with donors? So in section 3, with all the funding category recommendations, you will have talked about this somewhat. My experience is there tends to be a running pattern through all those funding category recommendations that I reiterate in this implementation section. So that's to say, maybe there's not enough of a personal connection or personal outreach to the donors. So maybe, one of the big takeaways, one of the big priorities overall in implementing the fundraising plan is that there's more of a focus on personal outreach and connection with donors. Will you have a calendar of activities? How are you going to track and be accountable for your implementation? I find having a calendar of activities is enormously helpful, and I'll use an actual calendar, or sometimes I'll use an Excel spreadsheet. But I like to be able to track from year to year what's coming up, how things went, what my timeline is. There's so much going on. It's really hard to be able to track every activity and remember it on your own. It's really helpful to have it written down, not only for one person, but for the whole organization. And then evaluate. How are you going to know if your implementation strategies worked? Are you going to have a quarterly conversation? Will you have a focus group with some donors? Will you know by your year-end numbers? How are you going to evaluate what you've implemented? So I mentioned the appendices. These are all kinds of things that you might include in your appendices to complement the overall fundraising plan. For those of you who might not be familiar, a case statement is a 3 to 5 page summary of your organization's, both their programs, your mission, your vision, a description of your staff, your successes, and where you need support and help financially. And then your fundraising policies are things like, you know, ethical guidelines that you might have for fundraising. What's your stewardship plan? What's your cultivation plan? How do you prospect potential donors? It's helpful to include your budget, any budgets you might have in the appendices, and any plans for professional development. So we would like our development staff to commit to, or board, to commit to X amount of trainings in the next year. These are great potential topics. And then finally, any descriptions for committees you might have, volunteers, staff, anybody related to fundraising, putting those descriptions into your appendices is a really nice place to have all that information. I mentioned a little bit about the case statement, and I feel like the case statement is really important. It can be in an internal and or external document. Usually when I work with organizations, we start with the case statement as a simple Word document, as an internal document that we use for future marketing, like brochures, websites, things like that. And these are all of the elements that I put into a case statement for my clients or for my organizations that I've worked with. It's really important to, if you can, to grab quotes from the community, again, whoever your stakeholders might be. And I tend to pair a program with a really great quote or commentary from someone who's been involved in the program. Certainly sharing the funding needs. A case statement is literally stating your case. These are all the great things we do. You know, now more than ever, we need your help to keep these programs going. A donation of X, Y, and Z will make a big difference. You may or may not want to ask for a specific amount depending on how you're going to use the case statement. And then a summary page is simply a one-page version of the case statement. It's a snapshot, it's bullet points, it's quick, it's easy. And this is a great tool for both your staff and your board to be able to use. Again, you're getting to that consistent messaging across the organization. I know the idea of fundraising policies can be a little bit intimidating. Most of us don't have time to write a fundraising policy, so I've included examples of both what fundraising policies are, but also where you can find some sample policies and procedures that might be helpful to you. And I believe in the slides, the bullet points that are underlined here are hyperlinks, but you can always do a web search for these as well. So just a few helpful tips as we get close to going. I'd like to leave a lot of time for questions. Plan your format of what your fundraising plan is going to look like. That is, is it a short version? Is it a shorter version? Is it a longer version with lots of narrative? How do you want your plan to look? Is it something that staff and volunteers will create internally? Or are you planning to hire a consultant who sort of, has that third-party external view? Or is it better to do it, inside? And to really set some deadlines, because I've seen folks work on fundraising plans internally that have gone very quickly, and others that have been dragged out for a really long time. So be clear about when you want to complete it and who needs to get involved in all of those pieces we've talked about today. Be sure to work across skills and departments. So again, talk to your executive leadership, talk to people who are running programs, talk to people in marketing. I know for some small organizations it's one person who does all of that. Bring in as many perspectives as you can, because if you've really taken the time to look at your organization holistically from a whole bunch of different angles, you're going to have a greater success both in writing your fundraising plan, implementing it, and seeing successes from it. And then one thing that tends to help in terms of getting investment from the leadership in writing a fundraising plan is that your fundraising plan is built into existing plans. So, for example, your strategic plan. Building your fundraising plan into your strategic plan might be helpful. And I know that sounds a little bit vague, but taking your strategic plan and having a 5-page fundraising plan to complement that, or 3 pages, or whatever it might be to complement that. Start wherever you can with your fundraising plan, even if it's small and it's a series of bullet points. That is a good start. Get something going. If it's a 30-page plan that no one's going to read, that's not effective either. So know your audience, be mindful of it, and make it palatable where you can. And then make your case internally to your board and your staff and your volunteers about why this is really important. I mean, I think a webinar like this can share some of the reasons why it's important, but it's much more powerful coming from you internally. So I have some time for some more questions before I go on to some resources that I wanted to share. So fire away.
Great. Well, Emily, why don't we do this? Just because I know we're getting a little bit past an hour, and that's great.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll go through no, that's okay. I'll go through a couple questions. I just know people are. Some people have just been mentioning that they need to drop off soon. So maybe while you're answering some questions, if you could put if you have any resources on a slide that you can put up on your screen, that would be great. Just so that while you're answering them, that would be awesome.
I'm so sorry about that. I lost track of time.
No problem at all. I just want to make sure people get to see some of your information. And I'm sure Emily will put on in just a couple minutes, some of her contact information as well. I'm sure Emily would invite you to contact her if you have any other questions. And before, Emily, I give you a question, let me just say before, I know some people need to drop off. First of all, I just want to make sure I thank everybody. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. Thank you for your, not just taking time to be with us, but really to invest in your own organization. Many people have been asking about fundraising software that Emily mentioned throughout her presentation, sometimes about fundraising software, and certainly we here at GiftWorks are not only thankful to be able to host today's webinar, but if you have any questions, I know all of you, when you registered for this webinar, you answered a question about GiftWorks, and if you had indicated that you wanted to be contacted about GiftWorks, then you're going to hear from someone on our sales team shortly. So, Emily, let me give you a couple questions here. Emily, Diana says, when the ED or the board of directors does not allow involvement by the development director, but they want you to raise the money and do long-range planning, what's the best way to handle this touchy situation?
Oh, wow. That is a good question and a tough one. My approach when there's resistance like that is try to provide opportunities for education from sort of external resources wherever it's possible for folks to understand why it's important and to educate them. I just don't, it's always beyond me how you can be asked to fundraise for an organization but not be given the tools to do so. And I think constantly making that case about, oh, well, can you tell me more, and this is why I need to know more, or here's somebody who can explain the connection between all these pieces we're discussing. So I think it just requires a lot of patience and a lot of education, and sometimes you just have to do the best you can with what you've got. I wish I had the magic wand on that one.
Sure, I'm sure we all do. Someone had said, and maybe I'm not sure if you can show, is there any examples that people can get of a good development plan? People were asking about that in general.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think there's two things, and actually the timing is really good on that you asked that. There is a few slides back here. There's a fundraising plan outline that I created that you can download on Idea Encore. And then some of these other pieces, like the development plan book by Linda, is great. I'm actually planning in the next month here to upload a full sample resource development plan to Idea Encore that's going to come with, if you buy it, it's also going to come with some consulting time. Because I've heard people say over and over and over, can I get something? And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this, which is it makes it tricky, but if you have something that you can like download and edit at least, it gives you some place to start. So I should have something like that coming out in the next month, but these other books are actually really great too. So
great. A number of people asked Emily, and someone had asked, could you put the first slide, the first resource slide, I think one more back?
Oh, sure.
There you go.
I'd be happy to. And, there you go.
Sure. I know as the CEO of GiftWorks, I'm going to sound a little bit self-serving, so I'm going to let you handle it. But someone had said, a number of people had asked the question, what is your recommended software for a database or, managing your fundraising information, donor donations, things like that?
Sure.
And so, Emily,
sure.
and feel free to certainly go beyond GiftWorks as well.
Okay. Well, I think, again, it's really dependent on what you want to use your database for. So if you need something that's super sophisticated and really high level, a lot of people like Salesforce. I find it to be challenging. I've used a number of different databases like Razor's Edge. Those are usually too much for me, to be honest. This is truly the case, is that I really like the GiftWorks platform. It's very intuitive to me, and it's very affordable. So now, on the other end of things, you should be able to go and research databases and have some sort of free trial or experience to test them out so you can get your fingers in there and see what makes sense. The other thing is, even if you are just starting out and you have an Excel spreadsheet, I mean, it kind of kills me to say that, but you've got to have something. Write down your donations, who gave them, when you acknowledge them, what your next step is. Get something to start with. But I do. One of the reasons I'm connected to GiftWorks is because I like their product. So, and that happened before all of this. So there you go. There's a lot out there, and it depends on the size of your organization. I find GiftWorks to be good for those small to medium-sized organizations in particular, because that's who I work with.
Great, thanks. And certainly, we know that GiftWorks isn't for everybody. And Harriet online had actually said, and I think it's a great recommendation, to check out Idealware, I-D-E-A-L-W-A-R-E, idealware.org. They do comprehensive reviews of all different fundraising solutions. We are included in that in terms of being reviewed, but there's a lot of resources out there. So as much as we'd want everyone to be using GiftWorks, we definitely recognize it's not for everybody, and some people just have different needs or things like that. So certainly feel free to check all that out. So
I'm glad that she brought that up, because that's a great resource for a number of things you might want to research out there, not just databases. And TechSoup a lot of times has some discounts on things. So yeah, that's a great recommendation. I agree.
Great. Well, Emily, just in terms of time, why don't I just give you a minute to provide any closing comments that you have, and then I'll have some closing comments myself. And so any closing comments?
You got it. You got it. So for those of you who have additional questions, you're welcome to email me. I think my Facebook link is wrong again, but if you just search me, I'm happy to connect with you. I love this stuff. I love helping nonprofits you know, we all need to support one another in growing our nonprofit businesses. So thank you to GiftWorks for allowing me some time to talk to you guys, and good luck with all your fundraising efforts.
Great. Well, Emily, thank you so much. And like Emily said, her email is right on the screen right now. There's a lot of questions that came in that we weren't able to get to, so I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question. But if you could, maybe just copy and paste your question right out of there right now and email it to Emily. We can fill up Emily's email box with questions. Keep in mind that Emily does this and spends this time with you. We don't pay her. She doesn't pay us. It's just an opportunity that we have to provide good information to nonprofits everywhere. I know a lot of you are asking about getting a copy of this webinar. We're going to send out, I know some of you got perhaps her social media fundraising presentation from last time, and we also have a handout for this one if you haven't got it yet. We'll make sure we send a link to that and also a video recording to this webinar. I think we actually missed it. We had a little technical issue at the beginning, so we might have missed a few minutes at the beginning. But we'll be sending a link out to all of you so you can see that. So between the handout and the link to watch this whole video again, hopefully you'll be able to not only internalize this information yourself, but also share it with your board, share it with other people within your organization. So well, on behalf of GiftWorks, the entire team here, Emily, a huge thank you to you for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. It's not just, you know, it's a great honor that I think we all have to try and equip nonprofits everywhere. So great. On behalf of GiftWorks and everyone here, Emily Davis, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great webinar, and look forward to seeing you on our next one, which I think our next one, and we'll send out information again, I think our next one's on May 22nd, where Emily will be talking, I think, about fundraising and the next generation. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.